They slept safely that night, warm inside their borders, unaware that the woman they had cast into the rain had just saved every one of their lives. The night they forced her out, the sky looked like a wound, bruised purple at the edges, angry and low, with clouds pressing down over the riverside settlement as though the heavens themselves were leaning in to watch. The torches in the great courtyard had been lit in 2 long rows, and they burned in spite of the wind, in spite of the first thin needles of rain beginning to fall, because someone had made sure they would. Someone had wanted this to be seen clearly, every face illuminated, every witness accounted for. Celeste stood in the space the crowd had made for her, not out of respect, but out of the instinct people have around things they consider tainted. She kept her hands loose at her sides. She had decided somewhere between waking this morning and walking down here that she would not fold them. She would not hug herself. She would not give them the satisfaction of watching her hold herself together. She was 24 years old. She had lived inside this pack's borders for every year of her memory, and she had never, not once, belonged to them. But she had served them. She had bled for them in ways they would never understand. And tonight they had gathered in their hundreds to tell her she was not enough. Alpha Garrett stood on the raised platform at the courtyard's head. He was not a cruel man by nature. That was the thing about him that had always made this harder. He was measured and considered and deeply, genuinely convinced that what he did for the good of the pack. He had a weathered face, gray beginning at his temples, and eyes the color of storm water. He looked at Celeste the way a man looks at a difficult calculation he has finally resolved. Celeste, just her name. No family name attached because she had none. That had always been the truth of it. This pack has deliberated at length. What I tell you now comes not from anger or haste, but from the considered judgment of your elders, your warriors, and your community. Community. The word moved through her like something cold. She found Vivian in the crowd without trying. Her best friend, her only friend really, if she were being honest in the way that hurt, was standing near the middle of the gathering, flanked by the women she ran with. But women who had never known that Vivian spent 3 evenings a week at Celeste's door. Vivian was not looking at her. She was looking at the ground, and her jaw was set in the particular way it got when she was fighting something. Celeste could see it from here, the guilt sitting in her body like something swallowed wrong. She looked away. Finding Vivian had been a mistake. She needed to be looking straight ahead. You were brought to this pack as a stranger, Garrett continued. You were given shelter, given a home, given every opportunity to prove your worth. And while we acknowledge the healing knowledge you carry, a slight pause, a concession he was clearly making against some internal resistance, we cannot overlook what you lack. You carry no wolf. You bear no bond to this pack through blood or mate. You are a liability we can no longer afford. Liability. She heard Rosalind's voice in her memory, unbidden. They say words like that when they're afraid, little bird. It means they can feel something they don't understand. Rosalind had been dead for 7 months, and Celeste still heard her constantly. You are to take what belongs to you and be beyond our border by the time the moon is overhead. Garrett's voice was not unkind, it was simply final. This is not punishment. It is a parting. A parting, as though she were a guest who had stayed too long at a dinner table. There was movement at the edge of the crowd then, a disruption, a voice cutting through, and she knew before she even turned that it was Matthias. Of course it was Matthias. He was pushing forward through the gathered wolves with the particular expression he wore when he had made a decision that he knew was going to cost him something and had decided to pay it anyway. This is wrong, he said loudly enough that the crowd shifted. You all know it's wrong. She has healed every one of you. She has never once asked for anything in return. Matthias, Garrett's voice was a wall. She deserves to be heard. Matthias. The Alpha's tone dropped a register, carrying the particular harmonic of dominant command that moved through a wolf's chest like a hand closing around the heart. Matthias stopped speaking. His jaw clenched. His hands had curled into fists at his sides, and his eyes found hers across the crowd. Brown and furious, and full of something that had always been too complicated for either of them to name. She gave him the smallest shake of her head. Don't. It won't change anything, and it will cost you everything. He understood. She watched him understand and hate understanding. And he went still. Celeste turned back to the Alpha. All right, she said, the same 2 words. The only 2 words there were. But that was not where the story began. The beginning, as Celeste understood it, was not the banishment. It was not even the years of hostility or the power that had started opening inside her like a cracked fault line at 20 years old. The beginning was a woman walking alone in a forest in the early morning, her basket over her arm, her mind on the properties of dried yarrow root. Rosalind had been the pack's healer for 30 years when she found Celeste. She had walked into those woods the way she did most mornings, following the paths she had worn into them over 3 decades, knowing every tree by the quality of light it let through its canopy, knowing every clearing by what grew in it and why. She was 61 years old, she had buried a husband, and she had grown accustomed, with the particular dignity of someone who has genuinely tried to make peace with their grief, to the shape of a life that would not include children. The crying stopped her 20 yards from the eastern streambed. She stood and listened because her first thought was bird, and her second thought was that no bird she knew made a sound quite like that. Then she set down her basket and walked toward it, parting the undergrowth with both hands, and found the baby wrapped in cloth that had once been fine and was now soaked through with forest damp and morning cold. Tucked into the roots of an old oak, with the specific placement of someone who had meant to come back and hadn't. Rosalind crouched down. She looked at the baby for a long moment. The baby stopped crying and looked back at her with dark, serious eyes. "Well," Rosalind said, "here you are." She gathered the baby up, cloth and all, and held her against her chest until the shivering stopped. Wrapped in the folds of the cloth was a shawl, woven with symbols Rosalind had seen only once before, in texts so old they belonged to another age. She knew what those symbols meant. She knew what they cost. She brought the baby back to the settlement and told the pack what she had found. The pack's response was immediate and unanimous and entirely predictable. This was not their problem. A stray infant from no known bloodline, no wolf scent, no pack mark. She was nothing. She belonged to no one. The elders argued that leaving her in the forest had been a kinder fate than the complications of raising an outsider within the pack structure. Rosalind listened to all of it, and then she went to Alpha Garrett's father, who was the Alpha then, and laid before him 30 years of service without complaint. 30 years of healing their sick and their injured and their dying with skill and care, and never once seeking recognition. And she asked for one thing in return. He gave it to her. The pack accepted Celeste the way you accept a stone in your shoe, aware of it, uncomfortable, occasionally making their displeasure known. But Rosalind was not a woman who required the world to cooperate with her in order to proceed. She built a life for the child with what she had, which was considerable. She taught Celeste to read by firelight, using the old healing journals. She taught her the names of 200 herbs and roots and barks by the time she was 8, their properties and preparations, the specific conditions each one addressed. She taught her to move through the forest without disturbing it, to listen with more than her ears, to trust her hands when they told her something that her eyes couldn't confirm. She taught her, most importantly, that her worth was not determined by the opinion of people who had already decided not to see her. "They will tell you what you are not," Rosalind said to her once, sitting by the fire while the rain fell outside. "They will say it often and with great confidence. Your only job is to know the difference between what they see and what is true." Celeste had been 12 years old. She had stored the words somewhere central where she could reach them quickly. She needed them often. The pack's hostility was not dramatic. It was the ordinary grinding kind that wears a person down through accumulation. Small exclusions, cold silences, conversations that stopped when she entered a room, invitations that were never extended. The particular quality of space people make around something they consider beneath their notice. She was Rosalind's girl. Strange Rosalind's strange foundling. She moved through the pack's daily life like weather, present and unavoidable but not truly attended to. There were 2 exceptions. The first was Vivian, who had arrived into Celeste's life at 15 when she fell out of a tree in front of Rosalind's cabin and broke her wrist in 2 places, who had subsequently appeared again the following week to say thank you, and then again the week after that with no stated reason, and eventually had simply become a fixture. Vivian was bright and social and deeply embedded in the pack's central life in all the ways Celeste was not, and she had made the calculation early that their friendship needed to exist in a particular way. Not hidden exactly, but not announced. She came to Celeste's door in the evenings. She did not sit with her in the common hall. She did not defend her in open company. Celeste had accepted this with the same clear eyes she accepted most things. Because having Vivian in this specific limited way was better than not having her at all, and she had learned not to ask the world for more than it was offering. The second exception was Matthias, who had no calculation about him whatsoever. He was 2 years older than Celeste. A mid-ranked warrior with a broad frame and a habit of saying exactly what he thought in situations where silence would have served him better. He had started sitting beside her at the few communal meals she was required to attend when he was 17 and she was 15. Not because anyone suggested it, but because he had looked at the way the space around her worked and found it offensive. He was bullied for it periodically, and without much creativity, by the pack members who felt his association with her required correction. He bore this with a flat, unimpressed expression that communicated his opinion of their efforts without requiring him to say anything. He had never told her how he felt. She had chosen not to look at it directly. Some things were easier to have when they remained unnamed. She was 20 years old when the power started. It came the way she imagined a river comes when a dam breaks. Not gradually, but all at once, in a surge that had force behind it from all the years of pressure that preceded it. She woke one night in a cold sweat, with her hands burning, and the smell of something ancient and clean filling the cabin. Like lightning before it strikes. She sat up in her bed. There was light between her fingers, pale gold, casting no shadows, or rather casting shadows that went in the wrong direction. She sat with it for a long time. Then she closed her hands and it went out. She told Rosalind in the morning. She showed her. Rosalind watched with an expression that moved through several rooms. Surprise, then recognition, then something that looked like awe settled into sorrow. Your mother, Rosalind said finally. Whoever she was not Wolf. No, Celeste agreed. This is going to be complicated. Yes. Rosalind looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked at Celeste. We tell no one. She opened her healing cabinet and pulled out an old journal, pages yellowed with age, filled with writing in a hand that was not her own. This was with you when I found you, hidden in the shawl. She turned to a page marked with a pressed flower. Your mother wrote this the night she died. She knew what was coming for her. She knew what you would become. Celeste read the words, written in ink that had faded to brown. A mother's desperate hope, a guardian's final blessing. Instructions for a gift that would save lives and cost everything. She gave her life, creating a shield around this very forest, Rosalind said quietly, so that you could be born, so that you could live long enough to understand what you are. What am I? Someone who will have to choose again and again between what you can do and what it will cost you. Rosalind's eyes were bright. Your mother chose. She chose you. Never forget that. It was also around this time that the attacks began. They came to Celeste first as visions, arriving in the space between sleep and waking. Impressions more than images, feelings with shape. She saw darkness moving through forest. She felt cold that was not weather, pressure that was not wind, a force that traveled through the land itself and hit living things like a blow to the chest. She felt it connect with wolves, felt the moment of impact. The way a body registers something, it has no framework to survive. She woke from these visions gasping, with the taste of iron in her mouth and the burning in her hands already beginning. Word reached Riverside in pieces. A pack to the east had lost 6 members in a single night to something no one could name. A pack to the north reported their crops failing, their wolves falling sick in patterns that didn't follow any illness Rosalind had in her journals. A pack to the west went quiet entirely. The elders said it was distance. They said Riverside was protected. They said whatever was happening to other packs was the consequence of weak leadership and poor preparation. Celeste lay awake 3 nights running after the first Eastern report, her hands burning, the pressure building in her chest. And she understood in the way her gift gave her understanding, not through reasoning but through contact, the way you understand cold by touching it, that it was coming here. It was already moving, and no amount of strong leadership or preparation would have any effect on it whatsoever. She got up in the dark, she went out into the trees, and she did the only thing she could think to do. She built a wall. She had no name for what she made. Light and intention folded from her palms, golden threads seeking the border of Riverside's territory. It followed the perimeter like water finding a crack, sealing itself with a sensation like a deep breath, like the click of a lock turning. She felt the territory inside it settle, safe, contained. Then the world tilted, and she went down on her hands and knees in the dirt, and her vision went to white. By the time she had pulled herself back to something like upright, she was shaking from her spine outward, and her nose was bleeding freely onto the forest floor. She lay there until she could stand. Then she walked back to the cabin and fell into bed and slept for 16 hours. Rosalind found her and drew her own conclusions and said nothing to anyone. She restocked her healing cabinet. She began keeping certain teas already brewed. She watched Celeste with quiet, careful eyes. And when Celeste came to her weeks later, after the second vision, after the second barrier, After waking on the forest floor with both hands numb and blood on her lip, Rosalind simply took her face in her warm, dry hands and said, "You are the most remarkable thing I have ever found, little bird, and I would rather you were ordinary and safe." "I can't stop," Celeste said. "I know." Rosalind tucked her into bed the way she had when Celeste was 7 years old and frightened of the dark. "I know you can't." The barriers cost her more each time. She grew thinner. She moved through some weeks as though the air had weight, her body marshaling its resources around some invisible central wound. The pack saw her sickness and called it weakness. She heard them say so. She let them say it. Rosalind wove careful stories around her most severe episodes. A bad season, a recurring illness. Nothing contagious, nothing to concern yourself with. The pack was satisfied to have an explanation that confirmed what they already believed, that Celeste was fragile, that she was a drain. She cast 6 barriers over 3 years, and the pack lost no one to the attacks that were emptying the territories around them. When Rosalind died, quietly in the early morning, with her hand in Celeste's and no drama about it, which was entirely in character, the pack waited less than a month before the conversations began in earnest. Celeste was 23 years old. Rosalind was 85. She had lived a long life and a good one, and she had closed her eyes with the satisfaction of someone who knew exactly what she was leaving behind. "You were the best thing I ever did," she had whispered to Celeste in those final hours. "The absolute best thing." Celeste had held her hand and tried not to break. After the funeral, the whispers started. She heard them through walls. She heard them at a distance when people forgot to lower their voices. She heard them in the quality of silence she received when she entered rooms. Why keep the outsider now that Rosalind is gone? What does she contribute? She's been sick half her life. A burden, a liability. She kept doing the work. She kept healing whoever came to her door, which they still did, because whatever they thought of her, they were not foolish enough to stop using a healer when they needed one. She kept building the barriers. She fell further each time, recovered slower. One morning after the 5th barrier, she woke on the forest floor at noon with no memory of how long she had been there. Frost in her hair, both hands dark with cold. She lay staring up through the canopy and thought with perfect clarity, "I cannot do this much longer." She hauled herself upright. She went home. She made her tea. She did not stop. But Garrett had already made his decision. Garrett had been Alpha for 3 years when Rosalind died. He had inherited the position from his father with all the weight and history that came with it. And he had inherited something else. A secret. A burden. A fear that sat in his chest like a stone and grew heavier with every passing year. 10 years ago, his daughter had fallen ill. Her name had been Clara. She was 8 years old, bright and quick and full of the particular fearless curiosity that comes from being loved completely. She had developed a fever that wouldn't break, a sickness that moved through her small body like a tide, pulling her further out each day until there was almost nothing left to hold on to. Celeste had been 14. Her gift had not yet manifested in its full form, but there had been signs. Small healings that worked better than they should have. Intuitions that proved accurate. She had come to Garrett and offered to try, just to sit with Clara, to see if there was anything her hands could tell her. Garrett had looked at this foundling girl, this outsider with no wolf and no place, and he had felt the old superstitions rise in his throat like bile. Magic demands payment. Power has a price. These were the stories his father had told him. The warnings passed down through generations. "We don't need your help," he had said. "We have healers, real healers." Clara died 3 days later. And Garrett had carried that choice with him every day since. The what if that followed him like a shadow. The possibility that he had let his daughter die because he was afraid of a girl who had done nothing but offer kindness. He buried the guilt deep. He told himself he had made the right choice. That magic was dangerous. That Celeste was dangerous, even if she didn't know it yet. That her very presence was a risk to the pack. When her power finally manifested, when she began her secret work of protection, he felt it. Not the barriers themselves, but the effect they had. The way the attacks stopped at Riverside's borders when they ravaged everywhere else. The way his pack thrived while others fell. And instead of gratitude, he felt terror. Because if she was powerful enough to save them, she was powerful enough to destroy them. And power like that, unchecked and uncontrolled, living among them without bond or loyalty, was a threat he could not tolerate. When Rosalind died, he saw his opportunity. He went to the elders with carefully chosen words. He spoke of liability and risk, of the burden Celeste represented without Rosalind's protection, of the resources spent on someone who contributed so little. He planted seeds and watered them and watched them grow into consensus. And when the vote came, it was unanimous. The vote happened on a Tuesday. Celeste knew about it before it was called, the way she always knew things, through the particular texture of the air around her, the way gazes slid off her in the common spaces, the way even the few neutral pack members had started treating her with the careful distance of people who were preparing to have clean hands. When Garrett summoned her to the courtyard, she was already dressed. She stood through it. She watched Vivian look at the ground. She watched Matthias be silenced. She said all right and turned and walked. She walked back to Rosalind's cabin. Her cabin now, though not for much longer. And she took what was hers, a worn leather satchel, the herb journals, Rosalind's handwriting filling the margins in her cramped, careful script, a change of clothes, the small carved wooden fox that Rosalind had pressed into her hands on her 20th birthday, saying, "I found this the day I found you, little bird. I think it belongs with you." She pressed her thumb against its smooth head and then tucked it deep into the satchel where nothing could reach it. Finally, she folded her mother's shawl, the symbols still visible after all these years, and placed it on top. She did not look at the cabin. She would not look at it. She had done her grieving for this place already, 7 months ago, standing in a room that still smelled of Rosalind's herbs and realizing that without that woman, she had no anchor in this world. She had known then that the pack would move quickly. She had simply hoped, stupidly and despite all available evidence, that she was wrong. She walked out into the rain and did not look back. She had made it to the edge of the tree line, the rain coming down properly now, her satchel on her back and the carved fox against her ribs, when she felt it. The vision came without warning. Not sleep this time, just a wall of sensation hitting her full in the chest, stopping her feet. She saw it, the dark force moving closer than it had ever been, faster, bearing down on Riverside's border with a pressure that meant it had learned something, had grown, had found a gap or a weakness, or simply accumulated enough force to try again. She stood at the edge of the forest in the rain. Behind her was a pack that had just thrown her out. Ahead of her was nothing. Nowhere. A dark road in an unknown world, and the complete freedom of someone who has been cut entirely loose. She thought of Rosalind. Not the end of her. Not the morning with the hand in hers. But earlier. Rosalind at the fire. Rosalind in the garden. Rosalind pressing seeds into soil with a patience that never seemed to cost her anything. "You give because it is who you are," Rosalind had told her once, "not because of who receives it." Celeste set down her satchel. She pressed her burning hands against the earth. She built the barrier. This time she built it differently, deeper, anchored further down, woven into the roots of the territory itself rather than just along its surface, because she could feel the weight of what was coming, and she wanted this one to hold. She wanted it to hold long after she was gone. She fed it everything. Every reserve she had, every thread of strength she had spent 3 years carefully hoarding. She fed it the grief of losing Rosalind, the grief of losing Vivian's courage, the grief of watching Matthias be silenced, the grief of every meal eaten alone, every door that had been closed. Every morning she had woken up inside this pack's borders and felt the specific ache of being surrounded by people and not belonging to any of them. She fed it all of it, actually. She built the strongest barrier she had ever made. And when it was done, when she felt it seal itself and settle and hold, when she felt the dark force hit it and fail, she felt herself go out like a candle. She was on her back on the cold ground before she knew she was falling. The rain fell on her face and she could not move. The trees above her were going in and out of focus, the branches blurring at their edges. She was aware, distantly, of her hands lying open beside her, the light gone out of them. She was aware of the cold entering her from the ground up, moving through her the way water moves through cloth. Rosalind, she thought, with what seemed like the last thought-shaped thing in her. "I think I'm done." The rain fell. The forest was very dark. And somewhere behind her, warm inside the barrier she had just built with the last of herself, the Riverside pack slept on. Unknowing and unharmed, Celeste lay still in the mud, and the cold closed over her like a hand. Matthias left on the second night. He had lasted longer than he expected. He had stood in that courtyard and watched her walk away and told himself it was done, that she was gone, that the pack's decision had been made, and there was nothing left for him to do but accept it the way he had accepted every other thing in his life that he had no power to change. He had gone back to his quarters and sat on the edge of his bed in the dark and waited for the feeling to settle. It did not settle. He kept seeing her face in the moment before she turned. The way she had looked at him when he tried to speak. That small, precise shake of her head that said, "Don't, it won't help." And the terrible calm in it. Not resignation, something older and more deliberate than resignation. Her dignity in accepting blows had become so practiced, it seemed like strength itself. He thought about Rosalind, about the way the old healer had looked at Celeste when she thought no one was watching, with a specific luminous pride, the kind of person carries for something they consider their finest work. He thought about the years Celeste had spent in that cabin after Rosalind died, alone, continuing the work because the work was what Rosalind had given her, and she did not know how to put it down. He thought about the sickness, the way it had cycled through her for 3 years, appearing without clear cause and retreating without explanation, leaving her thinner each time, quieter, more careful about how she used her energy. He had never understood it. He had only known that it frightened him in a way he had never been able to say out loud. On the second night, he stopped trying to settle and went to the stables instead. He told himself he would simply follow her trail far enough to confirm she had found shelter. He told himself this even as he packed provisions for 4 days. He told himself this as he saddled his horse in the dark. As he moved quietly through the sleeping settlement and out past the eastern gate, following the path she would have taken into the trees. He was a tracker by training. Following her trail should have been straightforward. What he had not accounted for was the rain. It had been falling since the night of the banishment, and it had flattened and blurred the ground, washing soft soil back over footprints, beating down the grass that would otherwise have shown the pressure of someone's passing. He found traces. A partial print in the mud near the tree line's edge. A broken twig at the height of a satchel's swing. But they were sparse. And the forest was wide, and the dark between the trees was absolute. He searched through the rest of that night and all of the following day, moving and expanding arcs from the last trace he'd found. Reading the forest with the systematic patience of someone who knows that the alternative to patience is failure. The rain did not stop. He was wet through within the first hour and remained wet through, his horse blowing clouds of breath into the cold air. The forest around them dripping and gray and utterly indifferent. He found her near sunset on the second day. She was 50 yards from the main path, in a shallow depression between two roots of an ancient oak. And she was so still and so pale in the gray light that he was off his horse before it had properly stopped moving. Sliding down into the mud on both knees beside her, he pressed 2 fingers to her throat with hands that were not entirely steady and found her pulse. There, present. Thin as a thread pulled too tight, but unbroken. Celeste. He said her name like it was a door he was knocking on. Celeste, can you hear me? Nothing. Her face was the color of birch bark. Her lips had a bluish cast at the edges that he recognized with cold clarity from battlefield wounds, from bodies that had been giving and giving until there was simply nothing left to give. Her hands lying open beside her, these were abraded at the palms where she had gone down on them. The cuts filled with dirt and beginning to close in the slow, uncertain way of a body that was trying to heal with insufficient resources. He took his outer coat and wrapped her in it. Then he lifted her. She weighed almost nothing, which hit him somewhere deep and wordless. And he settled her against him on the horse, her head against his chest, and he rode. He rode through the night without stopping. His horse finding the path by the particular instinct that horses develop when they understand that urgency is genuine. He held Celeste against him and felt the shallow movement of her breathing and kept his eyes on the dark ahead and did not allow himself to think about the possibility that the breathing would stop. He aimed for the Haven Valley settlement, 2 hours south at speed. He knew a healer practiced there who had trained under a tradition different from Rosalind's. Older methods, broader knowledge. He had no idea if broader knowledge would be sufficient for whatever this was. He went anyway. The Haven Valley settlement was awake when he arrived, which surprised him until he saw why. They had suffered recently. It was visible in the settlement the way damage is visible in a face, in the gaps, in the places where things had been and were no longer. Buildings with doors standing open and coal hearths inside. A communal fire that was tended by fewer people than the size of the space suggested it should be. Children sitting too close to adults with the specific posture of children who have recently been frightened and have not yet been fully convinced the frightening is over. The people who came out to meet him at the gate had the careful eyes of a community that had learned to assess threat quickly because it could not afford to be slow. I need your healer, he said, please. A woman was already moving toward him before he finished. A small, compact figure with silver-streaked hair in the brisk assessing manner of someone whose competence had been tested recently and had held. She looked at Celeste in his arms, and her expression shifted into the focused neutrality of a healer working. "Bring her inside," she said. "Now." Her name was Theodora. She worked on Celeste for 3 hours in a low-ceilinged room that smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke, while Matthias sat on a bench outside the door and stared at his own hands. A Haven Valley elder, a man with a quiet face and careful speech, brought him something hot to drink and sat beside him without asking. "She your mate?" the man asked. Matthias looked at the door. He didn't answer. The elder nodded as though he had. Inside the room, Celeste hovered in the space between. She was not entirely unconscious. She moved through something that had light in it, a quality of warmth, a sense of presence that felt familiar in a way she couldn't locate. She thought she smelled yarrow. She thought she heard at a great distance a voice she recognized in her bones saying, "Not yet, little bird," in a tone that was both instruction and endearment. Then Theodora's sharp, certain voice cut through. "There you are. Come back then. Come on." She came back. Waking was gradual and then all at once. Darkness, then gray. Dim, then the specific texture of rough, woven linen under her cheek and the smell of the room pressing in. She opened her eyes to low firelight, and Theodora sitting back in her chair with the expression of someone who has completed a demanding piece of work and is taking a moment before the next thing. "You were very nearly gone," Theodora said. It was not said with drama, just information. "I know," Celeste said. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Whatever you did, whatever you used this body for, it was beyond what a body is meant to sustain." Theodora leaned forward, resting her forearms on her knees. "I've treated exhaustion. I've treated power sickness in wolves who push their shifts too far. I've treated starvation and exposure. This was all of those things at once, and then something underneath all of them that I don't have a clean name for." She paused. "I am not asking you to explain it. I am telling you what I found so you understand the size of what you survived." Celeste was quiet for a moment. Through the wall, she could hear the low sounds of the settlement. Voices, a child calling out, the distant pop of a fire. "How long?" she asked. 3 days since the young man brought you in." 3 days. She pressed her hand flat against the blanket and concentrated on the sensation of the texture against her palm, the solidity of it. She was here. She was breathing. The barrier had held. She could feel that it had held the way she could always feel her work after she built it. A quiet hum at the edge of her awareness, like a sustained note, still standing, still sealed. "There is someone waiting," Theodora said, with what might have been the faintest trace of dry amusement. "He has been waiting since he arrived. He has slept approximately 4 hours in 3 days, from what I can tell, despite being told repeatedly that he could do nothing useful by remaining awake." The door opened before she could respond, and Matthias filled the frame, taking in the sight of her open eyes with an expression that he almost managed to control before it became fully visible. Almost. She saw it, the relief moving through him like a wave breaking, loosening something in his face that had been very tightly held. He crossed the room and sat in the chair Theodora had vacated. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. "You left without me," he said finally. "You weren't invited," she said. "I'm aware." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. He had the hollowed look of someone who had not slept or eaten properly in days, and there was mud still in the crease of his collar that he'd missed when washing. "Celeste, what happened to you out there?" She looked at the ceiling. Outside, the child's voice called again and was answered. "I built something," she said. "I've been building it for a while. This one I built larger than the others." She paused. "I didn't plan to survive it." The silence that followed had weight. "What do you mean you didn't plan?" His voice was very low. "I didn't mean it that way," she said quickly, turning her head to look at him. "I didn't choose it. I simply ran out. I knew it was likely, and I did it anyway." She held his eyes. "I needed it to hold." He looked at her for a long time. Then he sat back and looked at the wall and breathed in slowly through his nose and out through his mouth. She watched it happen and felt, in some tired, grateful part of herself, something like tenderness. They stayed with the Haven Valley pack. There was nowhere else to go, and the Haven Valley people, despite their own recent losses, opened what they had with the particular generosity of people who have learned that closed hands in hard times only makes the hard times worse. They were given a small, shared cabin at the settlement's edge, a woodpile outside, 2 narrow beds, a window that looked out on the common path. Matthias chopped wood and helped with repair work, paying for their keep with his hands, because it was what he had. Celeste, when she could sit upright, began helping Theodora. She saw the settlement clearly as her strength returned. She saw the gaps where people had been. She saw the way the pack's members moved in the evening, close together, never comfortable, always with one ear turned outward toward the dark. She listened to what wasn't said in conversations that stopped when she entered rooms. Not from hostility this time, but from the habitual caution of people managing a shared wound they hadn't finished bleeding from yet. She asked Theodora one evening, while they sorted dried stores together, what had happened. Theodora was quiet for a moment. Something comes, she said, through the territory. Not like any predator or sickness I've known. It moves through the ground, through the air. And when it hits, she pressed her lips together. There is no fighting it. There is no preparing for it. It comes and it takes and it goes, and we bury the ones it leaves behind. She looked at Celeste. We lost 15 people in the last 3 months. Celeste set down the bundle in her hands. 15. She thought of her own pack. She thought of the barriers she had built, of the attacks she had felt coming and turned back, of the lives inside those borders who had eaten their meals and slept in their beds and argued with their neighbors without ever knowing the force that had moved through the dark toward them and found a wall. That night she lay awake and thought about the children she had seen here. A girl of about 6 who had attached herself to Matthias with the uncomplicated devotion of small children for large, gentle people. A set of twin boys who still flinched at loud sounds. A mother who held her infant with an intensity that went beyond ordinary love into something more like desperate maintenance. She thought about what it meant to live without the walls she had learned to build, to simply absorb each blow as it came and keep trying to stand after it. She thought about Rosalind. You give because it is who you are, not because of who receives it. She made her decision quietly in the dark, without drama. When the attack came 4 days later, she was ready. She had felt it building for 2 days, the familiar pressure in the air, the quality of the dark changing outside the cabin window, the way the forest at the settlement's edge had gone silent in the particular way that meant something was moving through it that the birds and animals had decided to vacate their opinions about. She had said nothing to Matthias because she needed him calm. She had spent those 2 days eating everything Theodora put in front of her and sleeping as many hours as her body would accept, storing up. She was not at full strength, she was not close, but she was enough. On the morning of the 4th day, she walked out of the cabin before dawn and went to stand at the settlement's edge, at the place where the tree line thinned and the territory opened, and she pressed her palms against the earth, and she waited. Matthias found her there within minutes. She heard him come up behind her and stop. "What are you doing?" he asked quietly. "In a moment," she said. "Step back." He stepped back. She felt it coming in the soles of her feet and the burning in her hands and the way the air pressure shifted around the settlement's border. She took a breath. She opened her hands. The light rose through her, pale gold threading outward, seeking the territory's edges. But this time she did not build alone. This time Matthias stood 10 feet behind her, and she felt something wake in him, a resonance, an answering call. She heard him gasp, saw without turning the faint glow beginning in his own palms. His light was different from hers, brighter, shot through with white. Where hers sought to build, his sought to sustain. The barrier took shape between them, not from her alone, but from both of them, their gifts interweaving without either understanding how or why. It sealed. The force hit it. She felt the impact, but this time it did not drive her to her knees. This time Matthias's light wrapped around hers, bearing half the weight, and she stayed on her feet. And then it passed. The dark pressure receded. The birds came back to the trees. The air returned to being ordinary cold morning air, the kind that smelled of pine resin and damp earth and nothing else. Celeste lowered her hands. The light faded. Her legs were shaking, but she remained standing. She turned to find Matthias staring at his own hands with an expression of pure shock. The settlement was stirring. People had come out of their doors. They stood in the gray, early light, staring at the faint residual shimmer at the tree line's edge, at Celeste and Matthias standing together, at their own hands and their own standing bodies, alive and unharmed. "What was that?" someone said from somewhere behind her. She didn't answer. She was watching Matthias's face as understanding moved through him in stages. Disbelief, then recognition, then a hard, quiet reckoning. "The sickness," he said. His voice was very low. "All those years, every time you—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "You were doing this for Riverside. You were doing this the whole time, and that's what was making you sick." She held his eyes and didn't deny it. They called you a burden, he said. Yes. The words that followed required no elaboration. The truth had become visible in a way that could not be unseen. The settlement was very quiet around them. Theodora had come out of her cabin and was standing a few feet away with her arms folded, watching Celeste with the expression of someone who has received a very large answer to a very long-standing question. The Haven Valley people gathered slowly, drawn from their doors by the stillness where there should have been devastation. They stood in a loose circle and looked at each other and then at the woman standing at the edge of their territory, spent and pale and utterly calm. It was the elder who had sat with Matthias on the bench outside the healer's door who spoke first. He walked forward through the gathered pack until he was standing directly in front of Celeste, and he looked down at her for a moment. And then, with the gravity of someone who understands the weight of gestures, he lowered himself to one knee. "What is your name?" he asked. She looked at him. "Celeste?" "Celeste." He said it as though he were learning it. "My pack owes you a debt." She shook her head. "You owe me nothing. You gave me shelter when I had none. We're even." Behind her, she felt Matthias's hands settle between her shoulder blades. Warm and steady and entirely deliberate. She didn't move away from it. Later, when she had eaten and rested, and the settlement had returned to its cautious daily rhythms, Theodora came and sat beside her by the fire with the particular manner of someone who has been thinking carefully about what they want to say. "The barrier," Theodora said. "How long will it hold?" Celeste considered. "Longer than the others I've made. I built it deeper." She paused. "But not forever." Theodora nodded, then after a moment, "The one you built for your last pack. The large one. The final one." She looked at Celeste directly. "How long?" Celeste stared into the fire. The wood cracked and shifted, sending up a small constellation of sparks. "Not long enough," she said quietly. The fire burned down. Outside, somewhere across the settlement, the little girl who had attached herself to Matthias was singing something tuneless and cheerful to herself, the sound carrying cleanly on the cold air. Celeste listened to it. She thought about the walls she had built and the ones she had left behind, and the people sleeping inside them who did not know what kept the dark at bay. She thought about what it would mean when those walls came down. The answer, when it came to her, arrived not as a thought, but as a sensation. The particular pull she felt when her gift was trying to show her something she needed to know. She closed her eyes. In the vision, she saw Riverside, and Riverside was burning. The first survivors arrived 3 days after the vision. Celeste was at the settlement's edge when they came through the trees. A small group, 7 of them, moving with the particular gait of people who had been walking for a long time and were no longer certain their bodies would carry them much further. She recognized 2 of them before they were close enough to speak. A warrior named Davin, who had never said a word to her that wasn't a dismissal. An elder woman, Bryn, who had voted at the reckoning with her chin raised and her eyes flat. They saw her at the same moment she saw them. Davin stopped walking. Something moved through his face. Recognition, then confusion, then a complicated collapse of expression that had shame somewhere inside it. Bryn went very still. Celeste looked at them for a long moment, and then she turned to the Haven Valley gatekeeper beside her. "Let them in," she said. "You know them?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Let them in." She did not go to meet them. She walked back toward the settlement center and left the gate open behind her. Because a door held open is not the same as an embrace, and she was not ready for an embrace. She was not certain she would ever be ready for that. But she could open a door. Rosalind had taught her that much. More came over the following days, in 2s and 3s, and once in a group of 11. Emerging from the forest with the hollowed eyes and urgent bodies of people who have left everything behind them and are not yet sure what lies ahead. Celeste watched them come and directed them to food and warmth and rest without ceremony. She did not make speeches. She did not make them account for themselves. She simply watched the Haven Valley people absorb the newcomers with the same open-handed generosity they had shown her. And she felt something move through her chest that was not quite forgiveness and not quite grief, but contained elements of both. Matthias watched her do this with careful eyes. He said nothing about it, which she appreciated. He simply remained close, not hovering, not pressing, just present in the steady, undemanding way that had always been his particular gift. He had taken to sitting with her in the evenings by the common fire, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and she had taken to not moving away. It was on the 5th day that Vivian came. Celeste felt her before she saw her, felt the specific quality of her presence, the way you feel weather changing, a shift in the atmosphere that her body had been calibrated to recognize for over a decade. She was sorting dried stores with Theodora in the supply cabin when she felt it, and she set down the bundle in her hands and became very still for a moment. Go, Theodora said without looking up. She found Vivian just inside the settlement gate, standing slightly apart from the group she had arrived with, her arms wrapped around herself. She looked diminished. That was the only word Celeste had for it. Vivian, who had always moved through the world with the ease of someone fully at home in it, now seemed uncertain of her own weight in it. She looked up and saw Celeste, and her face broke open. Celeste stood still and watched it happen. Watched Vivian's careful composure come apart in layers, the way it does when you have been holding yourself together through necessity, and then suddenly the person you most needed to see is standing in front of you, and the necessity evaporates. Her eyes filled, her jaw worked. Celeste, she said. Her voice was barely there. Celeste looked at her oldest friend, at the face she had known since childhood. That had been present for every significant thing in her life, both good and unbearable. She looked at the guilt that lived in Vivian's eyes now, not fresh guilt, not the guilt of someone who had just done something wrong, but the worn, seasoned kind that had been carried for a long time. She had imagined this moment in the abstract during the long evenings of the past weeks. She had imagined anger, and she had thought there might be anger. But standing here now, looking at Vivian's broken face, she found something quieter and more complicated than anger. She found a sorrow that had already done most of its work. Come inside, she said. You need to eat. Celeste, come inside first. She brought her to the small cabin she shared with Matthias, sat her down beside the fire, put food in front of her, and waited while she ate with the mechanical focus of someone running on empty. When the plate was finished, and Vivian had wrapped both hands around a cup of something hot and was staring into it, Celeste sat across from her and waited. I knew it was wrong, Vivian said to the cup. I stood there and I watched, and I knew. She pressed her lips together. I told myself it was the pack, that the pack's decision had to come before. She stopped, started again. I told myself a lot of things. Her voice fractured on the last word. I know you saw it. I saw your face when you looked at me. The guilt. I wasn't brave enough to. She set the cup down. Her hands were shaking. Garrett is dead. 6 of the elders who voted. Davin lost his mate and both his children. Her voice had gone very flat, the way voices go when the facts being recounted are too large to be carried by ordinary tone. We didn't understand what was happening. There was nothing to prepare for it, no warning, no pattern we could read. It came and it came and it came and there was nothing. She stopped, pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment. Other packs had been living with it for years. We thought we were different. We thought we were protected somehow. She laughed, a short, hollow sound. We never even asked why. The fire cracked outside. The settlement moved through its evening rhythms. Unforgivable, Celeste said quietly. She was not talking about the attacks. Vivian looked up. She understood. Her eyes went very bright. Celeste was quiet for a moment. She looked at the fire. She thought about Rosalind, not for the first time today, not for the last time today, because Rosalind had become the fixed point she returned to when she needed to know which direction to go. She thought about what Rosalind had said about forgiveness once, years ago, when Celeste had come home from a particularly brutal day and sat at the table and asked, with the blunt honesty of a 14-year-old who had not yet learned to soften her questions, does it ever stop hurting, being on the outside of things? Rosalind had looked at her for a long time before answering. The hurt changes, she had said finally. If you let it, it can become something that reminds you of your own strength rather than their cruelty. But you have to choose that. No one can do the choosing for you. Celeste looked back at Vivian. What you did hurt me, she said. It came out steady and clear, the way hard truths do when they have been held long enough to lose their jagged edges. Not just that night, years of it. I understood why you made the choices you made, and I made my peace with them, and they hurt anyway. I need you to know that. Vivian nodded. Her eyes were very bright. And I am not what I was to you before, Celeste continued. That version of our friendship, the one that lived in secret, that I accepted because any version of you was better than none. I can't go back to that. She paused. I won't. I know, Vivian whispered. I don't expect. I'm not asking for. She stopped, gathered herself. I'm not asking for anything, Celeste. I just needed you to know that I'm sorry. That I know what I did, that I would undo it if. Her voice broke entirely. Celeste looked at her for a long moment. Then she leaned forward and covered Vivian's shaking hands with her own. We can be something new, she said quietly. I don't know yet what that looks like, but I am not going to turn you away. She let that sit for a moment. That's what I have right now. It's not everything, but it's real. Vivian looked down at their joined hands and breathed in long and unsteady and breathed out. It's enough, she said. It's more than enough. 3 nights later, Garrett arrived. He came with the last group of refugees, moving at the back of the line with the particular posture of someone who knows they have forfeited the right to lead. Celeste was helping distribute blankets when she saw him. He was thinner than she remembered, older in a way that had nothing to do with the passage of weeks and everything to do with the weight of what he carried. He saw her at the same moment, stopped walking. Something crossed his face that she could not quite name. Shame, certainly. But underneath it, something older and more complicated. A man who has been rehearsing words for days and suddenly realizes that no words will be sufficient. She held his gaze for a moment, then turned back to the woman she was helping, pressing a blanket into her hands with instructions about where to find food. When she looked again, Garrett had moved on, his head down, disappearing into the flow of people toward the temporary shelters. For 3 days, he avoided her. She would catch glimpses of him at the edges of things, helping carry water, splitting wood alongside Matthias, though they did not speak. Sitting alone at mealtimes, staring at his food as though it were a problem he could not solve. The other Riverside survivors gave him space. Not the respectful space they might have given an Alpha, but the careful distance people maintain around a wound that is still too raw to touch. Theodora found Celeste on the 4th morning, measuring out dried herbs with hands that knew the work so well they barely needed her attention. There's something you should know, Theodora said. She had a way of speaking that wasted no words. Every sentence arrived at its destination by the shortest possible route. About your former Alpha. Celeste set down the measuring cup. Go on. He lost his wife in the attack. Margaret, the midwife I consulted with for difficult births. Theodora paused. But there's something else. Something from before. She pulled a stool close and sat. 10 years ago, I treated a young girl from Riverside. 8 years old. Fever that wouldn't break. Her father brought her here after their own healers failed. Celeste became very still. I tried everything I knew, Theodora continued. But whatever it was, it had taken root too deep. She died here, in my care. Her father... She looked at Celeste directly. Her father was Garrett, and her name was Clara. The measuring cup in Celeste's hands had stopped moving entirely. When he brought her, he kept saying he should have tried something else, that someone had offered to help earlier, but he had refused. Theodora's eyes were steady. He said he had been afraid, that he had let fear make the choice for him, and by the time he came to me, it was too late. Celeste set the cup down very carefully. He never mentioned this. No, I don't imagine he would. Theodora stood. I thought you should know what you're dealing with. A man who has been carrying that kind of guilt for 10 years. It doesn't make him righteous, but it might make him understandable. That evening, Celeste found Garrett sitting alone by the settlement's eastern edge, where the forest began and the firelight didn't quite reach. He looked up when her shadow fell across him, and for a moment she saw him consider standing, consider leaving, consider anything that would spare him this conversation. But he stayed. May I sit? She asked. He gestured to the ground beside him, a permission that cost him something. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The settlement hummed behind them with the sounds of people making shelter into home. Somewhere a child laughed. Matthias's voice carried across the common area, low and patient, explaining something about proper wood stacking to a group of younger men. Theodora told me about Clara, Celeste said finally. Garrett's hands tightened on his knees. Of course she did. I offered to help when she was sick. You said no. I was afraid. His voice was rough with something that might have been anger, or might have been grief worn down to its sharpest edge. My father had filled my head with stories, old superstitions about magic and the prices it demands, about power that looks like a gift but comes with teeth. He laughed, short and bitter. I thought I was protecting her, protecting the pack. I thought refusing you was the responsible choice. And she died. 3 days later, his hands opened and closed. In a healer's house 2 settlements away, with me holding her hand and knowing that I had killed her just as surely as the fever did. Celeste looked out at the darkening trees. So when my power manifested, when the attacks stopped at Riverside's borders and nowhere else, I knew. The words came out flat. Of course I knew. I watched you get sick in the same patterns the visions must have come. I watched you grow thinner every time another pack fell, and we remained standing. I knew exactly what you were doing. And you said nothing. What could I say? He turned to face her fully. That the foundling I had called worthless was the only reason we survived? That the girl I refused to let near my dying daughter was spending her life saving people who had never once thanked her? His voice cracked. I couldn't face it. Couldn't face what it said about me, what I had done to Clara, what I had failed to do for you. So you exiled me instead. When Rosalind died, he stopped, started again. When Rosalind died, I saw my chance to remove you before the pack had to confront what you were, before I had to confront it. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. I told myself it was for the good of the pack, that your presence was a risk, that magic like yours would eventually turn on us. Every justification I could find, I used. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing. And then the barrier fell, Celeste said quietly, 3 weeks after you left. It must have been the last one you built, the one that cost you. He couldn't finish. It held for 3 weeks, and then it came. The thing you had been protecting us from all along. His voice had gone very soft. It took Margaret. It took Davin's entire family. It took 6 elders and 23 others. It would have taken everyone if we hadn't run. He looked at her with eyes that held no expectation of mercy. We arrived here, and there you were, alive, after I had sent you away to die, protecting these people the same way you protected us. Not because you owed them, not because they had earned it, just because it's who you are. Yes, Celeste said, just that. Garrett breathed in shakily. I don't ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just needed you to know the truth. All of it. What I did to Clara. What I did to you. The cowardice and the guilt and the monstrous selfishness of trying to make you disappear, so I wouldn't have to remember my failures every time I saw your face. Celeste sat with that for a long moment. She thought about the 14-year-old girl who had offered to help, about all the years after serving people who could not see her, about choices and consequences and the long, tangled thread that connects them across years. And she thought about what it meant to carry something like this. To wake every morning knowing your fear killed your child. Your pride killed your pack. To have to live inside that knowledge with nowhere to put it down. I forgive you, she said. Garrett's head came up sharply. You can't. I can. She kept her voice gentle but firm. Not because you've earned it. You haven't. Not because what you did was forgivable. It wasn't. She turned to look at him. But because someone once forgave me for being born different, for being inconvenient, for existing in a way that made others uncomfortable. Rosalind gave me that gift when she had no reason to, and I'm passing it forward. How can you? Because carrying anger would make me like you were, she said simply. And I've spent too many years learning to be someone else. Garrett made a sound that might have been a sob or might have been a laugh. What do I do with this? Celeste stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. You live with it, you let it teach you. And when you're ready, you use it to make sure no one else makes the same mistakes. She looked down at him. Theodora keeps Rosalind's journals in the healer's house. Read them. Understand what real protection looks like, what real sacrifice means. And then find a way to serve that doesn't come from fear. She walked away, leaving him sitting in the gathering dark. Behind her, she heard him weeping. Not the quiet, controlled grief of a man trying to maintain dignity, but the raw, broken sound of someone finally allowing themselves to feel the full weight of what they'd done. She did not turn back. The discovery came 2 weeks later, entirely by accident. Celeste had been working in Theodora's healing house, studying her mother's writings by candlelight. The journals Rosalind had kept hidden for 24 years, filled with accounts of what her mother had been, what she had done. The symbols on the shawl had been a map, of sorts, a guide to understanding the gift that ran in certain bloodlines. Not magic in the way people feared it, wild and dangerous and demanding prices, but something older, something that grew from love and intention and the deep connection between a protector and the thing they chose to protect. Her mother had written, "The gift does not choose us. We choose it. By choosing to love what we could walk away from. By choosing to stand when we could run. It lives dormant in more people than know, waiting for the moment when love becomes larger than fear." Celeste had been puzzling over that passage when Vivian arrived, carrying a child who had gashed her arm on a broken fence post. The cut was deep but clean, and Celeste set to work cleaning and binding it while Vivian held the girl steady, murmuring comfort. And then Vivian's hands began to glow. It was faint, barely more than a shimmer, but unmistakable. The same pale gold light that came from Celeste's palms, now threading through Vivian's fingers where they rested on the child's shoulder. Vivian gasped and nearly dropped her hands, but Celeste caught them. Don't, she said, keep them there. Keep thinking about keeping her calm. What is? Just trust me. The light grew steadier, and under Vivian's touch, the child's breathing slowed. The panic in her eyes faded. By the time Celeste finished the bandaging, the girl was nearly asleep, peaceful in a way that went beyond simple comfort. Vivian stared at her hands as the light faded. What just happened? Celeste looked down at the journals spread across the table, at her mother's words, at the possibility they represented. I think, she said slowly, that you have the gift too. It's just been sleeping. Over the next days, she tested the theory, carefully, gently, asking people to try simple things, to hold their hands over seedlings and think about growth, to press their palms to sick animals and intend health, to touch the earth and imagine protection. Most felt nothing, but some, Vivian's sister Brielle focusing on her children's safety, hands glowing soft green. Elder Ezra thinking about the settlement's well-being, fingers sparking silver at the tips. Theodora concentrating on healing, palms warming with amber light. And Matthias. Matthias, who sat beside Celeste one evening and placed his hands over hers. And the light that came from him was gold threaded with white, stronger than any of the others, wrapping around her own power like two rivers joining. I felt this before, he said quietly, when you built the barrier here, like something waking up inside me. Your bloodline, Celeste said, understanding flooding through her. It's connected to mine. Not the same, but complementary, meant to work together. She pulled out her mother's journals, showing him a passage she had found only the night before. The sentinels walk beside the guardians. They are not lesser, but different. Where the guardian builds, the sentinel sustains. Where the guardian burns bright, the sentinel ensures they do not burn out. They are the balance, the reason protection can last. Matthias read the words twice. All this time. You didn't know, neither did I. She looked at him. But now we do. That night, Celeste called a gathering. She stood before the combined settlement, Haven Valley and Riverside together, and told them what she had learned about the gift, about how it wasn't rare or special, but dormant in more people than anyone had guessed, about how it woke with intention and love and the choice to protect something larger than yourself. I want to try something, she said. I want to build a barrier around this settlement, but not alone. I want everyone who has felt even the smallest spark of this gift to try it with me, to see if we can create something that doesn't drain one person dry, something sustainable, something that lasts. Elder Ezra stood, and if it works, then this place is protected, truly protected, not by one person who will eventually fall, but by a community that holds each other up. And if it doesn't work, Celeste smiled, then we're no worse off than we were, and we'll have tried something new together. 23 people volunteered. Vivian and Brielle, Ezra and Theodore, Matthias, even Garrett, his hands shaking but his jaw set with the determination of someone seeking to finally do something right. They gathered at dawn, forming a circle around the settlement's perimeter. Celeste walked the circle, helping each person find the right position, the right grounding. She could feel the potential humming in the air between them. All these small lights waiting to be joined. Close your eyes, she said. Feel the ground beneath your feet. Think about what you're protecting. Not as an abstract idea, but specifically. The faces, the names, the reasons you're standing here. She returned to her position beside Matthias, took his hand. He squeezed once, I'm here, and she squeezed back. Now, she said, reach for it, the light inside you. And when you find it, let it flow, not forced, just allowed, like opening a door. She opened her own first, the familiar warmth rising through her center and pooling in her palms. Then she felt Matthias joined her, his light threading through hers, stabilizing it. And then, one by one around the circle, small lights began to glow. Vivian's came up like sunrise, gradual and golden. Ezra's sparked sudden and silver. Theodora's warmed steady as hearthfire. Brielle's bloomed soft green, the color of new growth. And Garrett's light came reluctantly at first, flickering and uncertain. But then it steadied. Deep amber, the color of old wood and long-held truths finally spoken. It wavered once, and Celeste saw tears on his face, but he held it and let it flow. Good, Celeste said. Now let it connect. Don't force it toward the person next to you. Just allow it to find them, like water finding water. The lights began to reach, to touch, to interweave. And where they met, they didn't fight for dominance. They didn't compete. They harmonized. Gold and silver and green and amber and white all flowing together, running along the circle from person to person until it was impossible to tell where one ended and another began. Celeste felt the moment it completed, the moment it became not 23 separate lights, but one continuous thread. She felt it sink into the earth, felt it rise and stretch and find the settlement's natural boundaries, felt it root itself in places she could never have reached alone, in the deep places, in the spaces between, in the collective will of people who had chosen to stand together. The barrier sealed. It was different from anything she had built before. Lighter, more flexible. Not a wall, but a weaving. Not one person's power forced into shape, but a community's intention given form. The colors danced together at the settlement's edge, a shimmer of gold and silver and green and amber, all sustained by love rather than will. She opened her eyes around the circle. Others were doing the same, looking at their hands, at each other, at the faint shimmer in the air that marked the barrier's edge. Little Iris, who had been watching from a safe distance, broke the silence. "Everyone is glowing," she said with the pure delight of a child who has just witnessed magic, "like stars." And she was right. Each person in the circle still held a faint luminescence, even as the barrier settled into its quiet work. They looked at each other with wonder and something like joy. "How do you feel?" Theodora asked, flexing her fingers. "Tired," Vivian said, "but not drained, not empty." "The burden is shared," Celeste said, "spread across all of us instead of carried by one. It's sustainable. It will hold as long as we maintain it together." "How often?" Ezra asked. "Once a season, perhaps. Gather again, renew the intention, reinforce the weaving." She looked around the circle at all these faces, new family and old, enemies and friends all standing in the same light. "It's not about one person being strong enough anymore. It's about all of us choosing to protect each other." Garrett dropped to his knees then, his hands still glowing faintly, and he wept without shame. "I'm sorry," he said to the ground, to the sky, to everyone and no one. "I'm so sorry." Vivian moved first, crossing the circle to place a hand on his shoulder. Then Ezra, then others. Not forgiving him with words, forgiveness would come later if it came at all, but acknowledging his presence in this moment, allowing him to be part of the weaving. Celeste watched it happen and felt something settle in her chest. This is what protection really means, she thought. Not standing alone against the dark, but weaving yourself so thoroughly into the lives of others that you become impossible to separate. The weeks that followed were quiet, learning to maintain the barrier, teaching others to recognize when their portion of the weaving needed tending. It wasn't perfect. Some people's light came easier than others. Some struggled to find the intention. But they learned together. They grew together. Garrett found his place teaching history, standing before groups of children and adults alike, telling them about the mistakes the old packs made, about the cost of fear, about the difference between strength that isolates and strength that gathers. He wore his guilt openly now, not as a shield, but as a teacher's tool. Vivian and Celeste rebuilt their friendship slowly, honestly, not trying to reclaim what was lost, but building something new in its place, something stronger for having been broken and mended with intention. And Matthias waited until late one evening when they were alone in their cabin, the fire burning low, the settlement quiet around them. He sat across from her and looked at her for a long moment. "I have something to tell you," he said finally. She set down the journal she was reading. "I know." "You know?" "Matthias, I've known for a very long time." Something between exasperation and relief crossed his face. "And you said nothing." "Neither did you," she pointed out. He looked at the ceiling briefly as though requesting patience from some higher authority. Then he looked back at her, and the exasperation fell away entirely, leaving only the thing underneath it, straightforward and unguarded and done waiting. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since before I had the sense to understand what it was. I love who you are and how you carry yourself and the way you never once asked the world to be kinder before you kept saving it anyway." He paused. "I should have said it before they had the chance to throw you out. I should have said it so many times before that, and I'm sorry I didn't." The firelight played across his face. Outside, the barrier they had built together hummed quietly at the edge of her awareness. Inside, her heart was doing something complicated and warm and entirely welcome. "I was waiting," she said softly, "for you to believe you deserve to be loved back. And now, Now I think you might finally believe it. She stood, crossed the small space between them, and took his face in her hands. I love you too. I have for longer than I let myself admit. You were the only one who ever saw me when no one else could, who sat beside me when it cost you, who rode through rain to find me when I was dying because you couldn't do otherwise. She smiled. It's about time we both said it out loud. He pulled her close, and she went willingly, settling into the space that had always been waiting for her. His arms around her head against his chest, the sound of his heartbeat steady and sure. Stay with me, he said into her hair. Not because you have nowhere else to go, not because it's practical or convenient, but because you want to, because we choose this. Yes, she said, simple and certain. Yes. 3 weeks later, beneath the barrier they had built together, Matthias and Celeste married. Ezra spoke the words. Theodora wove flowers into Celeste's hair. Vivienne stood as witness, tears streaming down her face while Brielle held her hand. And when Ezra asked if anyone had cause to object, Garrett stood, and every breath in the gathered crowd held. But all he said was, I have no objection. Only gratitude that she's still here to make this choice, and shame that I nearly prevented it. Celeste wore her mother's shawl over her shoulders. Matthias wore the carved wooden fox on a cord around his neck, a gift from Celeste that morning, pressed into his hands with the words, Rosalind gave this to me. Now I'm giving it to you, family to family. And when they kissed, every person in the circle felt a warmth run through them, a rightness, a sense of completion. 10 years later, the settlement had grown. What had started as Haven Valley absorbing Riverside refugees had become something entirely new. A community built on the principle that protection was a collective responsibility, that gifts were meant to be shared. That power was safest when it was distributed. They called it Silverweave for the way the barrier looked when the light caught it right. Threads of different colors, all worked together, all holding. Celeste stood at the teaching ground, watching 20 young people practice finding their light. Some were Haven Valley born. Some had arrived as refugees from other fallen packs. Some were children of the original survivors, growing up in a world where the barrier had always been there, where protection was something their parents built together 4 times a year. Iris moved among them with the easy confidence of a gifted teacher. 16 years old now, tall and graceful, with Theodore's steady hands and her own fierce determination. She had been Celeste's apprentice for 6 years. She would be a full healer in 2 more. Remember, Iris was saying, the light doesn't come from trying hard. It comes from caring deeply. Find what matters to you. Hold it in your mind. The light will follow. A young boy's hands sparked green. A girl's palms warmed gold. One by one, the students found their individual colors. Celeste smiled and turned away, heading toward the home she shared with Matthias at the settlement's heart. It was larger than the cabin they'd started in. They'd needed the space. She found him in the garden with their daughter. Aria was 5 years old, named for the grandmother she would never meet, but carried inside her all the same. She had Celeste's dark eyes and Matthias's stubborn jaw, and a smile that could light entire rooms. Right now, she was kneeling in the dirt beside her father, her small hands pressed to the soil around a seedling, her face scrunched in concentration. I can feel it, she said. It wants to grow, but it needs help. So help it, Matthias said gently. Show it you believe in it. Aria's hands began to glow, soft gold threaded with white, the exact mixture of her parents' light. Under her touch, the seedling straightened, reached, unfurled a new leaf. I did it! She looked up, beaming. Mama, did you see? I saw. Celeste sat beside them in the dirt, not caring about her skirt. Beautiful work. Aria launched herself into Celeste's arms, all skinny limbs and fierce affection. Can I practice with the barrier tonight? Please, I'm big enough now. We'll see, Celeste said, which they both knew meant yes. Matthias caught her eye over their daughter's head, and the look that passed between them held 10 years of moments like this. Quiet, ordinary, precious beyond measure. Later, when Aria was asleep and the house was quiet, they stood on their porch and looked out over Silverweave. Lights dotted the settlement, hearth fires and lanterns, and here and there, the soft glow of someone practicing their gift. The barrier shimmered at the settlement's edge, maintained by dozens of hands instead of one. Sustainable, enduring. Do you ever think about how different it could have been? Matthias asked. If Riverside had seen you. No, Celeste said. I spent too many years thinking about what they didn't give me. Now I only think about what I found. She leaned into him. This. You, Aria. This community, I wouldn't trade any of it. Even for a childhood where you belonged. I belong now. I belong because people chose me. Not because they had to. Not because I was born to them. But because they looked at who I was and decided I was worth keeping. She turned to face him fully. That's better than any belonging I could have inherited. From across the settlement, voices rose. One of the evening gatherings, people sharing stories around the communal fire. They walked together toward it, past homes they knew intimately, past gardens they had planted, past children who would grow up never knowing what it was like to live without protection, without community, without the certain knowledge that they were valued. At the communal fire, space was made for them without asking. Arya woke long enough to curl in Celeste's lap before drifting back to sleep. Matthias's arms settled around her shoulders, solid and sure. When Garrett stood to tell his story, the one he told 4 times a year, before every barrier renewal, Celeste listened as she always did. I made a choice once, he began. I let fear guide me instead of love. I let suspicion poison what could have been gratitude. And that choice cost lives. My daughter, my wife, 29 members of my pack. He paused. But I was given something I didn't deserve. A second chance. A woman who should have turned me away opened the door instead. And she taught me that forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing to build something new instead of staying trapped in what was broken. Around the fire, people nodded. They had heard this story before. They would hear it many times again. We gathered tonight to renew our protection, Garrett continued. But remember, the barrier we build is only as strong as our commitment to each other, to seeing each other, to choosing each other even when it's difficult. The renewal began. 23 people stood first, the original circle. Then others joined. Arya woke and padded over to hold Iris's hand, adding her small light to the weaving. The barrier renewed, stronger each time, held by more hands, sustained by deeper love. Later, when the fire had burned down to embers and most people had drifted home, Celeste sat with Rosalind's shawl draped over her shoulders and her daughter asleep against her chest. Matthias sat beside her, his hand covering hers. What are you thinking? He asked quietly. She looked at the dying fire, at the settlement sleeping safely around them, at their daughter, who would grow up knowing she was wanted, knowing she belonged, knowing her gifts were valued instead of feared. I'm thinking about what Rosalind told me once, she said, that I give because it's who I am, not because of who receives it. And she was right, but she was also wrong. She turned to look at him. I give because I choose to. And I choose to give to those who give back. That's not selfish. That's wisdom. She thought of all the years in Riverside, the giving and giving to people who could not see her, who did not want to. And she thought of these years in Silverweave, the giving that was met with gratitude, with recognition, with love returned. Both were giving, but only one was sustainable. Only one was chosen. This is my pack, she said softly. These are my people, and I protect them not because I have to, but because they made me want to. Matthias kissed her temple. Arya stirred and murmured something in her sleep about gardens and light. And around them, inside the barrier they had all built together, Silverweave dreamed its safe dreams. In the morning, Iris would continue teaching the young ones. Garrett would tell his stories to anyone who would listen, making sure the lessons lasted. Vivian would tend the community gardens with her sister. Theodora would train the next generation of healers. And Celeste would walk through her settlement with her daughter's hand in hers, teaching her the names of herbs and the properties of roots, and the most important lesson of all, that worth is not determined by the people who refuse to see you, but by the clear, steady truth of who you choose to be. The sun would rise, the barrier would hold, the community would gather and work and laugh and protect each other. And somewhere in the quiet between moments, Celeste would hear Rosalind's voice. You were the best thing I ever did. The absolute best thing. And she would think, no, we were all of us together, this whole beautiful, complicated, chosen family. We are the best thing, and she would be right.